Hello everybody, my name is Vitali and I'm going to talk about typography. And I hope that the information that I'm going to share here with you today is going to help you understand typography a bit better and improve your relationship with the words that we use every day. So there's going to be quite a lot of material, and I hope you bear with me. If you have any questions or something seems unclear, feel free to raise your hand and I'll ask what you have in mind. But in the end, we'll have room for questions, so maybe hold on till then. So a little bit about myself. I'm a UI UX designer here at Fraktio and a designer by trade. I do all kinds of stuff in multimedia, and basically everything I think revolves around type for myself. And I think it's kind of weird when people say like, oh, typography, like that's so hipster or kind of specialized or something. And I'd say that typography involves all of us, and I'd also say that there's never been another time in history where everyone has been so aware of fonts and typography and typefaces. And I think I can prove that. Does this look familiar? This is, I think, something that a lot of us deal with on a daily basis. And I think that a lot of people, they can be a bit frustrated by fonts and how to make it look nice. And I think that, it doesn't take much to demystify this. And I think that we all need to give ourselves credit because we all design type every day. When you write notes, you kind of give headings, you columnize things, you maybe give some colors and stuff. So, this is something that we do already. And for example, if you're writing post-its, if you got something urgent, it's going to look kind of different than something that's just, saying what's up, basically. And you have to understand that this is basically the essence of typography. It's designing words to have more meaning, to serve the content that it's presenting. And, if you look around, you'll notice that type is everywhere. It's used to give structure to meaning. It helps us quickly make sense of things in patterns that make them recognizable. And so, of course, here we have some color and we have an image. This is pretty much all just text. And the moment you see it, you see, oh, navigation, headline, category, time of publication. The use of weights and different styles helps us make sense of the world. And, if you look at this image in Times Square, you'll see that type is everywhere. If it's selling you an ad or telling you what street you're on or the name of a company. I think it's really safe to say that we live in a world built by type. And, I think it's important for us to first get some definitions out of the way and talk a little bit about what it is that makes type. So generally when we're talking about typography, we're talking about fonts and typefaces which were built for printing. So basically what this came from, so movable type. And this is individual pieces of metal put together to make sentences and paragraphs, which is different from, let's say, calligraphy, where we write stroke by stroke each letter. And this, of course, is different from lettering, where we draw each letter to make nice, intricate compositions. So, quickly review. Typesetting is about printing, calligraphy is about writing, and lettering is about drawing. And, I love all these three things, but we have only so much time today, so I'm going to focus mostly on the history of typesetting and typography in that sense. But, I think still I need to kind of nail it in why good typography is important and what it can accomplish. So, what's the problem here? This message is saying, take me serious, this is something important, but, it's all loose and funny. And, likewise, this also just doesn't seem to feel right. It's asking to be loose, but then it's really strong. And nowadays we see a lot with motion graphics, we have like kinetic typography where it's all like moving and really like awesome animation, but I think that, you don't need animation. Something like this in itself kind of makes you feel like there's a bit of motion going on, or alternatively, kind of gives you a sense of motion. Anyway, you can do all kinds of like fun little things with typography quite simply if you just understand the basic principles. And so, you know, this is something by Jeff Clark based on an image by Philip Halsman. And, you know, it's crazy what you can do with typography when you understand the rules. You can bend them, or even kind of break them, and still make sense, and make it aesthetic and nice, pleasing. And I think, you know, letters, they're beautiful. There's something amazingly balanced about them. They can stand by, you know, by themselves as a single letter, or fill hundreds and hundreds of pages and help your eyes understand what it's reading. I mean, it's really amazing if you think about the technology of letters and typography. And of course, the true test of type is, how do the letters work together? And, you know, some of you might recognize this sentence if you ever used Windows Font Selector or the like. Basically, you know, the reason why this is so popular is because this utilizes every character in the alphabet, from your ABCs to the XYZs. So you kind of get a feel for how this typeface or font will present itself. So here I go talking about fonts and typefaces. You know, what does that all mean? What's the difference between a font and a typeface? So these are all fonts. We got Kepler Standard Display. So we got regular, italic, bold, and bold italic. And together these make a typeface, also known as a font family. And so, you know, one font is a collection of characters which are called glyphs. And what are glyphs? Well, you know, why don't we just call them characters, right? Well, there's a reason for that. And as you can see here, as an example, you know, sometimes when you're writing things together, they flow better if they're actually one single combined thing. But if you just squeeze these two together, you know, what happens to this dot? So a lot of fonts, they have glyphs for combined characters. And this helps with the flow. They make it more aesthetic. Like, there's nothing wrong with this, but I think we can all kind of agree that the one on the left looks superior aesthetically. It's more balanced and harmonious. And this is a very important thing about fonts and typography. It allows flow, unless it wants you to stop and really like pay attention to it. So how do we do this? How do we create these different effects with type? Well, I think we've all heard at some point the term of serif, you know, a serif font. So what is a serif font? Well, this is an example. This is Kepler Standard, one of my all-time favorites. You'll see it pop around this presentation a lot. And you got these little things here, these feet. And these are serifs, basically. When you get a lot of text together, it kind of leads your eye from one letter to the next, and it kind of helps with this flow. So that's why it's used a lot in body text, and they're called Roman fonts. They're entrenched in history, which we'll get into soon. And then you have sans serif fonts, which of course in French means without serifs. So when you look at the feet, there's no serifs to be found. And of course, you got stuff like slab serif, or slab serifs, where then the serifs are brick-like, very flat. And so, you know, if we look at them together, we can see how the kind of serifs help lead one letter into the next, form this kind of thing. And so this is used very often in body, so like the mass amounts of text. It looks nice and gorgeous and very ornamental compared to sans serifs, which are more geometric and, you could say, plain, not so undulating with the stroke thickness. And then you have the slab serifs, which are used very much in programming. And one of the reasons for that is that these fonts are usually, or very often, monospaced, meaning that every single space is of equal width, which helps with code because then all the letters are basically in a grid, making it easy to go around and left, right, in all directions. And so serif fonts as I kind of alluded there earlier, and everyone knows Times New Roman, right? So they're called Roman fonts, and sans serif fonts are often called grotesque fonts. And there's history to this. Like, the thing is that there's nothing's by accident in a way with the language that we're using. So let's learn some terms and some history. So the space between two rows of text is called leading. And some people call it leading, but the reason it's called leading is because this was literally lead that was put in between rows to create the space between them back when things were done with those metal letters we saw earlier. And that's also where we get the words uppercase and lowercase, because I mean, imagine if you're working as a printer doing this motion all the time, you're not using capitals very often, so you put them a bit higher on the upper shelf or the upper case, and the lower case is what the little smaller letters are for. So it all makes sense. And so that's leading. And then we have kerning, and this is what causes a lot of frustration often, because it's about the distance between the letters themselves within a word. And of course, this is just default kerning in Keynote, so don't kill me. But basically, you just want to kind of, there's different ways that computers handle kerning, and it's all about balance. But this is something that I cannot fit into this presentation. But you know, just if you have kerning options, check them. And so the line where pretty much all the letters rest on is called the baseline. And the line where the capital letters hit is called the cap height. And so, you know, we got this stuff down here and up here, and these are ascenders and descenders. And where the lowercase letters fall on their topmost part is called the X height. And so letters that, fonts that have very tall X heights are much easier to read in small sizes because they take up more space and thus are easily read in smaller sizes. So we have descenders and we have ascenders. And together all these lines make up the body height, which is also sometimes called the point size. So we got all the lines that we talked about together here. The descender line, ascender line, we have the cap height, X height, and baseline. And this is basically the form within which fonts get to play, so to say. And I mean, all of this is pretty difficult because you have to consider stuff like the axis, which is basically the imaginary line that goes through a letter. And you know, some fonts might have, you know, a straight vertical axis, and then other letters like a B and a D might kind of slant to a side. And all of this is really important because, you know, the thing is that you can design one letter that looks really pretty, but then imagine when you have, you know, rows upon rows of this text, you know, if it clashes too much, you end up with Comic Sans, right? Like it should ideally work together as a cohesive unit. And so letters usually start from their stem. It's also called a stroke, especially if it's angled, like on an A. But this is basically like the root stroke from which all the other forms of the letter are built upon. Then you have the terminal, which is the end of a line, also called a finial if it's like a serif, but that's, you know, kind of getting technical. But and the empty space inside of a letter, whether it's closed or open, is called a counter, but usually if it's left open, we call it an open counter, and also an aperture, which kind of refers to this kind of distance between the strokes and the ending point or the terminal. And this is all going to be very important later. But basically, the point is that there's all kinds of terms for typography, but if you think about it, you know, none of this is excessive. It's like jazz. Like, there's a lot of terms that mean very specific things so that we can understand what we're doing. Because the endeavor to create a typeface, or let's say a font, I mean, you know, a font family, whoa. But even to make one font in one specific weight is a big undertaking if you want to do it right. And so, you know, when we look at something like this and all this glorious font-rich world that we live in nowadays, I think it's good for us to ask, like, how do we get here? How did, we start from oral tradition and work our way up to serifs and sans serifs and slab serifs. So if you bear with me, we'll take a little trip through history. And so, we all know that everything started with oral tradition, telling stories around the campfire. But of course, anyone who's played broken telephone knows how terrible that is for conveying information. So before we had proper writing, for a long time we'd make lines like how many sheeps the guy in the other cave owes me or something like this. But the first kind of like proper signs of written language is the limestone Kish tablet from Sumer around 3500 BCE. But these are individual engravings, this is not printing. So for that we have to go like another 1,000 years forward, and we see this Akkadian brick stamp. This was used to mark bricks of when they were made, and this one commemorates the building of a temple. It kind of like reminds me of how we use postage marks. We always have different themes and celebrate different people throughout history from it, and they were doing it way back then. But this is iconographic, kind of like hieroglyphics. We use symbols instead of specific letters, and this has issues. I think we can all tell from this example. We're kind of making a full circle again, and this is something that you're going to notice hopefully throughout this presentation, that there's all these, like with fashion and other things, like there's these circles that we go through. So what does this say? What is this saying? Well, what if I told you it meant that Jack realized time is money? How many got exactly that? Exactly that. I bet it's not quite many. So this is the challenge with iconographic language, that you have to really know the culture and the specific time to really know what it is that's being said. So, it's important to know that, from those iconographic language writing systems to modern day, they all have heritage. Like, there's nothing random, just like the terms we use to describe typefaces. It started from a picture of a cow, for moo, and then we got the syllable, and then we got the letter moo, which is where we get the M and the U. So all these things, they have meaning. Language is about the history of mankind and of civilization. So, racing forward through history, we started getting closer to what we know nowadays as the Latin alphabet. So this is a tablet called the Sippus Prasinus, written in Etruscan, found around 3rd or 2nd century BCE. And, this is a good example of what writing was like. Of course, it wasn't all stone tablets. There was writing by scribes with ink, but it was tedious. Don't get me wrong. It was beautiful. It was glorious. But it would take decades to learn how to make this, and the amount of knowledge that you'd be able to make in half a century was very limited. You'd spend 50 years. How many copies of a 500 book would you be able to make in a single lifetime, right? And make it this ornamental and beautiful, right? So this is the Gospel of Mark, the first page of it by an Armenian artist called Sargis Tisak. I really dug myself in a ditch trying to go with his last name there, but it's beautiful. Here's another example. The thing is that it took hundreds and hundreds of years to refine writing to the point from going from those stone tablets and the big writing to be able to condense a lot of information in a small space, because you have to remember, inks were expensive, paper of this quality that it would last for a long time. It was not easy to create. So they spent a lot of time building all of this. So, what's the solution? How do we not spend our entire lifetime dedicated to the pursuit of writing beautiful, ornamental, but informationally dense writing? Well, of course, printing, right? But it would take quite a long time before we figured that out. And actually, it started in the East, in Tang Dynasty China. So basically the invention, the great aha, was that, okay, well, if we take these little blocks of wood and we carved letters in reverse on them, we could kind of like use them like stamps. But then of course, you don't want to go one by one, so you would create a frame and you would put these letters in a grid, and this was what we call movable type. So you could move these blocks around and make new compositions. And of course, this is insanely intricate. I mean, just imagine making something like this with wooden blocks. Not easy. And of course, the fact of the matter is, ink and the repeated motion of printing on paper, it would wear out something like wood. Wood is not really well suited for something like this. But, it would take until 1450 for a guy called Johannes Gutenberg to change the game forever. And he did it with something like this. This, my friends, changed everything. It is impossible to overstate the significance that this had on humanity's development. You went from the rich and powerful hoarding all the books and knowing how to read and write to something being completely available to everyone. And he did this by modifying technologies that already existed in his time. So the printing press was basically a varied version of the screw press, which is kind of like just spinning something around to squeeze two things together. And he was a goldsmith and a very accomplished metallurgist, so he was able to, with the help of some people, create this black letter alphabet, which was far superior to using wood, because it could withstand much more wear and tear. And he also made ink that was cheaper and very suited for this printing. And it looks kind of cool too. But so, the end result was fantastic. I mean, look at this. This is the 42-line Bible. I mean, the Gutenberg Bible, and he had done other printing projects before, but this was the one that really changed everything. It still had some hand-drawn stuff, some ornamental things, but most of this is just, mass production. And really, I mean, again, the printing press, wow. In 50 years, just in West Europe alone, they had printed 20 million copies of books. Imagine that. You go from like single-digit stuff, maybe 3 digits if you're lucky, that's held to the highest regard and guarded by people with sharp objects and metal skin, to, here, read this. I mean, basically the printing press invented mass communication. Before it would be some dude, a scribe, going and yelling the king's message on a town, and now you could take a piece of paper and totally change the way you see the world. I mean, this was such an immense game changer. It really cannot be overstated. So the font, or typeface, if you may, used by Gutenberg to print the Bible, I mean, it was high tech. This was the culmination of writing technology, of being able to make a lot of information densely packed into a small space, with it being very legible and easy to reproduce. But of course, again, with the circles, people were like, all right, well, this is great, but I want something softer, something rounder, right? So one good example of this is Nicholas Jensen. He was a French dude, proper legend. He basically single-handedly made Venice one of the, actually the first printing capital of the world by just being awesome. So we have a lot of we have a lot of modern typefaces that were inspired by him, but he basically started the Renaissance period, or was one of the major figures behind the Renaissance era of type design. And basically what he did was he used much more variation in his strokes. So if you remember, in black letter, everything's kind of like thick. But here it's kind of more like a wide pen, where you go from thick to thinner and you get this variation that looks really nice. And this is kind of like more humanist, as we would call it in typographic terms. And this is a combination of two different sources of inspiration, basically. So you have, most famously, the Trajan column for Roman capitals, and these are kind of based on Euclidean geometric principles, and you combine that with what the priests were writing, also known as Carolingian minuscule, of different examples of which can be seen here. So this is basically why we call Roman type Roman, but we also have italic. What's that all about, So, we all use italicized writing often, and, in typography we kind of like call it underlining with type. It kind of creates emphasis. And we can use it in text to, for example, distinguish between what's happening inside internal monologue and what's being said, and things like that. And so this is basically based on this more cursive, calligraphic type of writing. And this was also originated from Rome and parts of Italy during the Renaissance period. And originally it actually only had lowercase letters, so they were still using normal Roman for the capital letters, but of course then this changed. And, this, I think, is a good example of kind of like, if you philosophically think what's the difference between normal Roman and italic writing, italic is much more expressive and ornamental, whereas Roman is kind of more to the point. So, I think together it's really beautiful. It just works amazingly together. So buckle up, we're going to quickly go through the evolution of typography from this point onward. So the cat was out of the bag, everyone was trying all kinds of stuff. So after the Renaissance period, we got the Baroque phase in the 17th century. And this is also hand in hand with the improvements in technology. So now we got much more thinner kind of terminals or finials, things were sharper, and you'd have dual axes, kind of like what I was talking about. So like the D here, you can kind of see it slants in a way on the imaginary line, whereas the E is kind of vertical and total. And so after the Baroque phase, we get the Neoclassical period, where things get even sharper. Just look at that. That is sharp. And this is basically just impossible to do beforehand. And so after that, we get the Romantic era, where we go even thinner. Because again, it's the technology, it's improving, it's allowing us to do things that were just impossible before. And things got a bit flat, as you can see. So that was all the rage. And, after this, people were kind of like, all right, we've kind of done a lot of this, so let's go the exact opposite way. And, mass marketing and advertising happened. So we get monster fonts, and these were huge. They would take up as much ink and space to say, hey, look at me. And, we're still stuck with them today. But, it's just another thing into the repertoire. But the big change came in the late 19th century and early 20th century, where everything changed. Then we got this rationalism. We said, to hell with modulating strokes. Let's just make it one thickness all the way around. And look at that. There's like basically no space between the end of the E and the bridge of it. This is something that no one really did before, and it's very geometric, it's very circular. So, I think, it's not just me. The fact of the matter is that Helvetica, as seen here, it's very impersonal. It's a blank state. It allows you to kind of use it for whatever purpose, which is why it's so popular. But it actually rose to prominence after World War II, when everyone was kind of sick and tired of the old way of doing things and wanted a new way, a new fresh start. So what better way than the most impersonal font in the world? And this was followed by the geometric modernist movement, which kind of further went with this whole let's do everything in circles phase. And you can kind of like dismiss it like, oh, it's just another iteration of Helvetica, but there's a lot of really distinguished finesse in these geometric modernist fonts, which I think are glorious. And they are very popular. Futura, for example, is used by Nike extensively everywhere, and it's a heck of a font. And I think that that's one of the things that like a font family might look very different from a single font, a font weight. So if you saw this and didn't immediately think Nike, that's why. I mean, fonts are immensely adaptable and can camouflage if they're used correctly to whatever context they're being used. So, of course, after this, again, circles. People in the 20th century and 21st century said, okay, we're done with geometry and rationalism. Let's go back to the good old days. So it's kind of impossible to package all of that neatly into one thing. So, it's just called Post-Modernism. It influences from everywhere. You get, this is a Bookmania created in around 2000 or early 21st century. And they're all over the place. They get inspiration from everywhere. It doesn't matter. There's no classifications anymore because we have all the data. So we just make what feels right and cool. So, computers came around. Good old bit fonts. Who misses these guys, huh? Well, everything kind of changed with the advent of the Macintosh. It's kind of a, I don't know, boring thing in a sense, again, Steve Jobs, but, the fact of the matter is, in college he took a calligraphy course, and he drove his Macintosh development team wild because he wanted that the Mac writer have proper fonts, and that involved vectors. And vectors were kind of hard back in the day with the computing power that was available at that time. So, all fonts nowadays are done with vectors. And what vector basically is that you have mathematical information that creates the curves and the different points that mold the shape. And you combine this with laser printing, and you have an entirely new industry, desktop publishing. This, again, had a huge effect on business, communication, advertising, you name it. Changed the game for everybody. So, due to time, I can't go into more detail. Just to give you a little scratch of what a scratch this was, this is 25 different systems for classifying typefaces. So I'm just giving you a quick runaround of the history, but this is an endless well. It really has to do with us as humans and who we are. Because, again, writing and typography give shape to the content, which sculpts and gives meaning to it. So, to kind of put this all into one point, I think it's well said when you just think that good typography is about respecting the content. You got to think about what it is that you're trying to accomplish. What is it that you're doing? How can the way it looks affect or serve what it is that it's trying to say? So let's do a little exercise. Let's put this to practice, right? So we got ourselves a generic title, and we got some nice lorem ipsum, which is basically Pig Latin. It doesn't mean anything, just gives us something to work with. So we got a title, subheading, and some body text, in good old Helvetica. So, let's spice it up. Boom. That wasn't so hard. Well, this is basically just applying some principles that we were talking about. So, we increase the leading, the line height, basically. We use different font weights to distinguish the different characters. So immediately, when we look here, it's all the same value. It's very utilitarian. But then here, your eyes immediately make sense of what you're seeing. So you got the title, you got the subheading, and we made the body into 2 columns because it was possible with the space that we have. And again, it's immediately a bit more legible. And this is all in Keynote. I didn't take this into Illustrator and do some fancy schmancy stuff. So this was just quickly doing a couple of things to make it more legible. And one last thought, which is not exactly related, but I think important in terms of digital rights in the modern age, because I think this is something that a lot of people are talking about, and rightly so. You know, I like to do music, and I dabble in creating video essays and this type of stuff, and of course, you know, who owns what? And with fonts, I think it's a pretty valid question, right? I mean, you got people spending years of their lives to craft these letters, and then they sell them, and we use them, but we don't get sued. You know, is that because all the companies that you know, is Apple and Microsoft and all these other people who make software that have fonts included, are they paying, you know, willy-nilly for everything? I mean, of course, they have licensing, but the way the law sees it is that when you buy a font, you can do anything with the rendering of the font, right? So you can't repackage the vector data that creates the font and say, buy this. But if you make things with the font file, they're totally free to be used, as long as, of course, you did actually buy it and have a valid license. So, you know, I don't know, is this, you know, a model for some sort of, you know, changing copyright law or anything, but I'm saying that this maybe is reason for pause for thought. And so, you know, if you found this interesting, there's a documentary called Helvetica about our favorite font, the font that everyone loves to hate, but just can't seem to get rid of and is everywhere. And, you know, don't get me wrong, Helvetica is awesome, but, you know, everything serves its purpose. It doesn't mean we should plaster it everywhere and forget our heritage. And for this presentation, I used these two books, Ellen Lupton's Thinking with Type and Robert Bringhurst's Element of Typographic Style. So, you know, if this is interesting, I recommend picking up maybe Thinking with Type and then seeing, once you're done with that, if you want to take it to the next level. But Thinking with Type is awesome, whether or not you're involved in design or not, but it just has a lot of really practical resources. And I mean, it was written by a professor who tried to find a book like this, couldn't find one, and then she wrote it herself. So I think that's pretty cool. So we got time for questions, but at this point I just want to say thank you, everybody. So any questions? Yes.
Have you done your own font already?
Bitmap, back in the day. It's on the list. It's on the list. But I'm, you know, again, I'd classify myself as like a aficionado, and I like to read about it and study it, but I don't feel like I'm, you know, quite there yet. I've been doing calligraphy for like 2.5 years or something, and kind of getting more and more into lettering. And I think that I really want to nail down my black letter and script styles before I start pushing vector bits around, because I think that's one way to lose your sanity. Yeah. Any other questions? Back there.
Yeah. Why everyone loves to hate Comic Sans? It's kind of thing that, well, everyone hates Comic Sans, but why did it become so popular at
and why is it still so popular, right? People
What
keep
happened
using
and what kind of drugs he took?
Yeah, so the story with Comic Sans, I think it was created in the early 90s at Microsoft. And, you know, to answer your question primarily of why do designers hate it so much, is that it has no internal logic. So when we were talking about shaping the axis and making it all work together, those letters do not work together. They are, you know, it's not pleasant to read. I mean, try to read a book printed in Comic Sans and get back to me, and I think you'll agree. It's not really nice. But I've heard anecdotal reports, you know, maybe there's some research, but Vethi has told me it's not necessarily the truth, but people who have reading problems can sometimes benefit from Comic Sans because it forces the brain to reach each single letter to make sense of the whole. So, and you know, maybe because it requires so much attention to be read, people like taking it, and it looks different from anything else. So if you're trying to advertise, it's unfortunate. If you can't hire a designer, people tend to use Comic Sans. Yes?
And it's the biggest font I've personally found in Word. But my actual question is that I'm just beginning to write my bachelor's thesis. Which font should I be using if I didn't actually want to write it in Times New Roman or a bachelor's, whatever?
Yeah.
Comic Sans.
Yeah. if I don't want to use Times New Roman or Comic Sans or
Yeah.
I don't know, Arial, well,
Right, yeah.
give
No,
me
don't
a
use
Give me
Arial.
a personal choice. That was the work.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you want to, I mean, nowadays we have Google Fonts, which has
Yeah.
quite a nice amount of selections. And I remember reading research about this, that actually if you use a font that's close to the default font, because usually when they have theses, they have the
Yeah.
instructions, use this font, use that.
Yeah.
But they found that people who use a similar font,
Yeah.
but you know, not radically different, but kind of similar, they actually tended to score a bit
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. Well, that's the question I was like actually asking.
Right.
But you solved what I wanted to.
Yeah.
Yeah, not what I asked.
Yeah, I mean, you know, something that, you know, if, for example, it's Times New Roman or Georgia, then, you know, something like Baskerville or Garamond could look really cool. But I think if you look at Google, they have nice lists, like good serif fonts.
All right.
You know, make your pick, make sure it doesn't look too different, and I'm sure you'll be great.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? Yes?
How much do you think that religions like contributed in development of typewriting?
Please give me a hard one. Well, I'm no theologian, but of course, you know, it was interesting actually when I was doing some research for this presentation. You know, I came across all these lists of like, because of course, you know, you can't, you know, to quickly answer the question, you can't separate the history of typography from the history of religion, because it was the religious dudes doing all the writing and developing these forms. And so when I was Googling this stuff, there was a lot of lists and articles talking about what are good fonts for worship and praising of his name, you know, and this type of stuff. So I think they are interconnected, but then again, so is the development of civilization and human history. Like, it's something that's been been with us, you know, since before we were even able to write things down. We were doing sacrifices and worshipping the sun and fire and all that stuff. So I think they're really interlinked. But I think that question kind of goes beyond the scope. Like, it's, you know, it's a difficult one. Yes.
What's the future of typography? Or
Yeah.
except emojis?
Except emojis, yeah. Well, I mean, emojis are interesting because it is kind of like the first universal language we got.
Yeah.
But of course,
Seems that.
yeah. But of course, it's like, again, like with
But
all
what would be the some
ne-
kind of next step?
next step.
What's happening?
Well, I mean,
the
there's a lot of writing without using letters, you know. So like a lot of advertisements, they make like an A with bananas or something, right? So it's like kind of writing without writing seems to be a big thing. And of course, Linotype, this very famous foundry, especially back in the day, they had a lot of fonts where like they would use like the shadows of animals to create different letters and whatnot, you know, and we all know YMCA, right? So, so you know, I think it's something that people keep pushing, that they keep experimenting and trying different things. But ultimately, I think we're always going to come back to the basics. You know, it's you just can't get over the you know, as long as we have the Latin alphabet, you know, I mean, that's the thing. Like today's presentation was very much about Western typography and Western typographic development, because of course there's a whole nother story of like what's been going on in Asia and different parts of the world that of course impossible to put into this. But if you love beautiful calligraphy and typography, I really recommend looking at like Persian stuff and Arabic writing. Like because of the way that their letters are created, they can create portraits that actually are like verses from the Quran and whatnot. Like it's really amazing. Yeah. So I hope everyone kind of got something out of today, and maybe look at fonts and typefaces a little differently now and kind of see how it builds the world around us. So again, thank you everybody.